For nearly 80 years, the Black Dahlia murder has attracted theories, suspects, and speculation. This week, the headlines declared they'd found someone new. They hadn't. Here's what actually happened. I'm Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime. If you watched our series Broken, the Black Dahlia Murder, you learned that dozens of people were investigated as suspects in Elizabeth Short's murder. In the decades that followed, many theories emerged about who the real killer was. Just this month, another sensational claim was made, one I felt the need to respond to, with the help of someone who knows more about the Black Dahlia case than anyone I know. You may have recently seen the headlines, especially a Los Angeles Times article that's pulled the Black Dahlia case back into the spotlight. The story centers on an amateur sleuth theory that connects Elizabeth Short's murder to the Zodiac killer. Marvin Margolis is named as the new suspect in this decades-long cold case. But here's the thing. Marvin Margolis is not a new suspect. He's the central figure in years of original investigative work by author William J. Mann, whose new book, Black Dahlia Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Midcentury Hollywood, was recently released. Long before the LA Times article ran, Bill had already uncovered Margolis' background, his psychological profile, his movements after the murder, and the documented evidence that points to him as a prime suspect in this case. In this episode, Bill joins me again to respond to the headlines, clarify what his research actually shows, and explain why so many popular theories over the years, especially those driven by armchair detectives, have often missed the bigger picture. This conversation isn't about chasing a new theory. It's about context, evidence, and why this case still resonates almost 80 years later. Let's get into it. So I want to welcome William J. Mann, Bill Mann, back to the show. I'm very excited that your new book, Black Dahlia Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Midcentury Hollywood, is out today. So this was great timing because we had some follow-up information I wanted to let you respond to. But first of all, welcome back and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back.
So the first thing I want to do is set the scene for our listeners who maybe have not heard the story. I know that some have because it was shared with me. The timing, I think, is important because we do know that when we went through our series, Black Dahlia, that I was able to glean a lot of information that I think people had not yet heard about in your book about Elizabeth Short and about the actual investigation of the Black Dahlia case. So I want to, go into now what has come up in the news and have you respond to that. So let me just set the scene real quick. In recent days, the Los Angeles Times published an article that brought the case back to people's attention. It focused on an amateur sleuth theory that attempts to connect Elizabeth Short's murder to the Zodiac killer. Now, we've heard this before, this kind of trope before, but this is, again, a kind of a reigniting of that theory. But in doing so, it also names Marvin Margolis as what's being described as newly identified or newly discovered suspect. But what's been lost in much of this coverage is that Marvin Margolis isn't a new suspect. He didn't emerge from internet sleuthing or forums or things like that, or a late-breaking theory. He emerged from years of original on-the-ground investigation that you laid out in your new book. This is, and the book that I mentioned is being released right now. The work that you've put into the book and the information goes beyond these headlines. It goes into Margolis' background, his psychological profile, his movements after the murder, his documented criminal history, and institutional roadblocks that you ran into, including the FBI's refusal to release its file on him. So before we dig into that article, I'd love to hear your reaction to seeing this story break in the way it did and how it feels to hear about this suspect you spent years uncovering, suddenly now reintroduced to the public as if it was something new.
Well, thank you for that intro. I appreciate that. I heard about it. Yeah, my agent actually let me know about it, and I took a look, and I said, "Wow, this is really exciting." I mean, my first reaction was, "Wow, this is pretty amazing." If he's linking this possible killer of Elizabeth Short to the Zodiac killing, well, I want to know more. And I remain completely open to the idea. I would not be surprised if Marvin Margolis committed crimes of that sort. In my book, I don't claim to have solved the case. I think we talked about this last time. What I do is I present theories that are the most logical and can be supported by the most evidence. We can never be absolutely sure that anyone killed the Black Dahlia until the LAPD opens up their files on the case. And basically, everything after 1948 is closed to us. That's the period of time in which you point out that the original detectives and the district attorney's office began focusing on Margolis. So you're right, he's not a new figure. He was known at the time. He's been mentioned in other books, not so much as a suspect, but the previous writers have documented that Margolis was a boyfriend of Elizabeth Short. They were a couple for about a month in the fall of 1946. What's never been really explored, and it's been right there for anybody who wants to find it. The district attorney's files are free and open. Anybody can request them. I was surprised how easy they were to get. And in those files, Margolis is spelled out as a serious candidate. Finus Brown, who was one of the original detectives, is quoted in I think it's 1949 or 1948 or 1949, and he says he could be a very good suspect. He had been interviewed early on and then sort of dismissed. He had an alibi for the night. But by this point in 48, 49, Finus Brown is taking another look at him, and he then begins his own investigation into Margolis. What he found about Margolis at that point, we don't know because at that point the district attorney turned the case back to the LAPD, and those files have not been opened to us. So Margolis is a serious candidate, and I spend a lot of time talking about him in my book and about how um, his military records reveal so much. He was in trouble many times. He was arrested for several minor crimes. And also, as you point out, this very curious thing occurred when I asked for his FBI file through a Freedom of Information Act request. And made this request for really everyone in the book because I wanted to see if they had something. And most of the responses from the FBI were, we have no records matching your request, relevant to your request. So that basically means they don't have any files on these individuals. In a couple of cases, they did have files on the individuals, and they said it's going to take us a couple of months to process this, but you'll get them, and I did. With Marvin Margolis, I get a very different response. It said, we're not confirming or denying we have records on this individual, but we are denying your request. So I put in an appeal and I said, okay, well, okay, I know you can't confirm or deny, but then why is my request being denied? And I laid it all out. I said, this is a guy who very possibly committed murder, a very infamous murder. And there are still family members who are looking for justice for this. There are friends who are still looking for justice for this. And I was denied a second time. So my appeal was denied as well. So all of that makes Marvin Margolis a person of interest. And so I agree with this new theory that, he was the killer of Elizabeth Short. I can't yet endorse the Zodiac piece because I haven't done that research. I haven't seen all of the research. What I have seen leaves a little bit raises too many questions for me. I'm somebody who says I need to see the facts. I need to see if you're making a claim, I've got to see exactly where this claim comes from. And frankly, an article in the Los Angeles Examiner from 1947 is not something that's going to convince me because they were making up stuff all the time, as everybody knows, to sell newspapers. So I was excited and I remain very open to it. I want to see what might come of it if the LAPD decides to reopen this and go after it. I'd be very excited to see what might happen.
Yeah, that whole piece about them not releasing the FBI file on Margolis, because I mean, first of all, he was in the military. He did have, some problems with the law and things like that. So there probably is something. There's some kind of record there, even if it doesn't pertain to the Black Dahlia, which it may or may not. But I think just that part alone, the fact that you can't get that record lends itself to conspiracy theories,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, what should listeners make of this, or what did you make of this fact that they're not releasing this? I mean, is there anything that you kind of speculated upon? Like, why would that be, or what did you come up with?
Well, I'm somebody who really tries to avoid conspiracy theories. I think they just um, the very fact that it's a conspiracy theory means they can't explain something with hard evidence, so they've got to come up with a conspiracy. And yet, at the same time, this is very curious that the FBI would not release these records, given the fact that they're, you know, 70 years old and nobody's still alive from that period. Um, and the fact that they were very quick to tell me who they didn't have records on and were very quick to send me the records of those they did have records for tells me, and this is the only conclusion I can actually draw from that, is that they are treating Marvin Margolis differently than they treated anybody else. Why that is, who knows? One of the possible answers to that is during his time in Chicago when Margolis was arrested for fraud, and this I describe in the book. His partner in crime was a guy named Pinky Davis. Now, Pinky Davis goes on to be a fairly well-known figure in the Chicago mob. He actually gets arrested, spends some time in jail. He then turns informant and starts giving names. Was there something in there that connected Marvin to the mob? Did he also turn evidence, and so the FBI is protecting him? It could be anything, and or it could be that he's still wanted as he's still a possible candidate for the killing of Elizabeth Short, and the FBI doesn't want to acknowledge that, or because it's still technically an open case, which is rather absurd, but it is still technically an open case. So it could be anything. All I can tell you is that the FBI is treating Marvin Margolis differently than it treated anybody else.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like, if he was connected to some other FBI case, it's possible
True.
that it's like being put in that file. And
That's
so
right.
that's something maybe just not being released. So that makes
That's right.
sense in a way. It's one of the many, you know,
Right. Yeah,
theories
and
you can
maybe
come up with.
maybe it's the Zodiac killer case. That's what I'm saying. I look forward to somebody getting to the bottom of this. Someone
Right.
who could get to the FBI and get those records, if possible, some law enforcement, somebody at the LAPD, maybe who has the ability to see these records. Because maybe that will prove this latest assertion that he was also the Zodiac killer. I don't know, but I do know that there's a lot of reason to suspect Marvin Margolis.
So that's the thing. That why do you think the Black Dahlia and the Zodiac, looking at the type of crime it was, the evidence, the crime scene, whatever the MO, whatever you want to call it, why are those two linked so often, or they have been over the years, do you think?
Yeah, I've wondered the same exact thing because they are so very, very different.
Hmm.
And the MO, the signature, they're just so different. In fact, there's nothing like the Black Dahlia case. You can't compare Elizabeth Short's murder with something else, right? Because it's so unique. And and which is part of the reason it's still remembered today because it was so you know, grisly and gruesome and unlike anything before or since. So yeah, I don't really know why it's gonna, they're both in California, which, but different parts of California. California is a really big state. I know that Steve Hodel, in his series of books, also claimed that his father was the Zodiac killer, in addition to being the Black Dahlia killer. And I don't really know why, but I do think there's an impulse among true crime aficionados, of which I am one, to want to link these all up, to make sense of it in some way. Even after Elizabeth's murder in 1947, and there were subsequent murders in Los Angeles of women, there was the impulse, not so much among the investigators, but among the public and among newspapers to try to link them all. This must all be the work of one killer. When Jean French was found murdered, they said another Dahlia slaying, and there were initials carved on her body or written on her body that appeared to they might be BD, and there's okay, we've linked these two crimes. And Harry Hansen, one of the original detectives, was there at Elizabeth Short's crime scene, and also at Jean Short's and at Jean French's, and he said, there's nothing to link these two. These two crimes were done by different perpetrators. So I think it's that impulse to want to make sense of something that is ultimately senseless.
Right. Yeah. And I guess if you tied them together, you can kind of package that up in one neat bow.
Right, yeah.
These are the biggest California, mystery kind of true crime cases. And that would be really
Yeah,
intriguing. I mean, it would be
yeah.
great. But,
Yeah, and
I always kind of wondered, it's like we're pulling out strings here, but I don't see them connecting.
yeah, it is really hard to connect them. But of course, as one detective that I interviewed said to me, you can't rule anything out either. Somebody who kills somebody in 1947 with, with a heavy object to the head, and then, bisects the body and drains all the blood, might also 20 years later take a shotgun and start killing people. So it's not without possibility. It's just I
Right.
don't see the obvious linkage. And
Right.
the when Steve Hodel claimed that his father, George Hodel, had killed Elizabeth Short and also was responsible for the Zodiac killings, he had some retired LAPD detectives backing him up, saying, "Yep, this is right. This evidence is right there." And I'm aware that there are some retired LAP detectives saying the same thing now, that this Marvin Margolis must have killed, must be the culprit in both cases. Okay, then let's see the records that are inside that are there that are still being held under lock and key. What did Finest Brown say about Marvin Margolis in 1950? What did he find something that exonerated him? I don't think he did, but I'd still like to see those records.
Yeah. So what really stands out in your book is how grounded it is in the records, in the arrest records, military files, other documents. How did meticulously going through like that paper trail of things, how did it kind of put into focus for you in general about this case?
Well, there's so much material. I mean, we're limited in what we have, right? It's not like, as we've just been talking about, we don't have all of those files from the LAPD. But even with what we have, the district attorney files, a small amount of the LAPD files, the FBI files, newspaper accounts, interviews, to make sense of that, because it is a lot when you put it all together. I had to start cross-referencing and indexing so that if somebody's mentioned in one record, I know where they are in another record, whether it be a newspaper article or the district attorney file or a summary case. And it was only by suddenly making sense of all of these people and all of these stories that I could start to draw some conclusions. And what I do at the end of the book is that I take all of the suspects who were still standing at the time of the district attorney's investigation, and I go through all of the evidence against them and evidence that might exonerate them. And I present it all in each case. And in each person that I go through, ultimately the evidence either collapses or is just not there to really see this person as a liable suspect in the case. The only one I was not able to do that for was Marvin Margolis. He was the only one that there was evidence that could possibly identify him. So I think I may even talked about this last time. One of the things that guided me was the very well-known formula that the FBI um, uh, profiler Steve Douglas had talked about, um, which is why plus how equals who. So the why is the reasons that might motivate someone to commit this sort of a crime. And then the how is having the ability to commit this crime. Margolis was the only one that fits the how and the why. He has the rage that the military records reveal. I mean, it's a and interviews with the family revealed. Other instances, the rage, the resentment, you go through his academic records, which I got, and he's dropping out of courses all the time in the months that he was dating Elizabeth Short and leading up to her murder. So he's dropping out. His professors are telling him he's not good enough. His father always told him he wasn't good enough. So he's got this rage and resentment at the world. He has PTSD from some really horrible um, fighting during the war, but he's also got the ability to commit this crime. He knew from his surgical experience in the army how to dissect a body. That was something he had learned. One of his jobs was to go out into the battlefield and pick up limbs that had been blown off of people. And he would carry these limbs back and try to reassemble them. He knew about the body. He wanted to be a chiropractor, so he knew about the spinal cord. He would have known which vertebrae was the easiest to slice through. So he has the how and he has the why. He's the only one of all these suspects that I go through one by one that has that.
So what was it that right away, because you said that first, they rounded up all the names of all the suspects and what he was one of them because he had dated Elizabeth Short. Why was he dismissed so quickly? I know later on they came back to him, but why in the initial investigation does it seem to you that he was kind of just dismissed?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it's pretty obvious when you look at the record. So Bill Robinson, who was his friend and roommate, and had also lived with Elizabeth Short and Marjorie Graham at the Guardian Arms Hotel, when the news breaks that and the body is identified as Elizabeth Short, Bill Robinson, on his own accord, comes into the homicide department and says, "I knew her, I shared a room with her." And so, they're taking down his information. They say, well, who else was there? And he mentions his roommate, Marvin Margolis. And they say, well, why isn't Margolis here? And Robinson says, well, he didn't want to come in. And they say, well, he's got to. We need to talk to him. So eventually Margolis does come in and speaks to them. But as is noted in the district attorney investigation, he came in reluctantly. But he has a alibi for that night, for the night of the murder. He had gotten married very shortly before the killing, right after, maybe even just a few weeks after he and Elizabeth broke up, or Elizabeth broke up with him. Uh, but his wife is giving him an alibi for that night. Now, spousal alibis sometimes are always looked at askance, but it was an alibi, and um, they let him. They fine for now because they also had a million other suspects to be
Mhm.
tracking down. This is the period where they're looking for Robert Manley. So right now, Manley is the top suspect. He's in. He's there. They've got a manhunt out for him. The reporters have been going to his house. They're waiting for him to show up. And there's this buildup, both within the LAPD and also in the press, that Manley's the guy. He was the last one to see Elizabeth alive. He had a psychiatric discharge from the army. So he was like the guy. And once Manley is pulled in and they interview him and then he's let go, then there's somebody else. It's Lynn Martin and then it's somebody else. And there's this constant new suspect in the news all of the time. And the detectives were constantly having to put down what they're doing and go interview this latest person that the Los Angeles Examiner is saying did it. And even though they complained to um, Captain Donahue and said, let us do our job. Why are we giving credence to all of these people who are basically crazy confessors? But he had to do it. And so I think what had ended up happening in that crush of investigations and press coverage that lasted well into the summer of 1947, Marvin Margolis slipped through the cracks and they forgot about him.
Hmm. There was that one portion of the book where you talk about this strange incident. It's a little bit unclear exactly who was involved, but we know that there was some kind of incident where Elizabeth Short says that she was struck by either Bill Robinson or Marvin Margolis. When did that detail come out? How did you discover that?
That was in a testimony given by Ann Toth. Ann Toth was Elizabeth's friend, and they had both lived together at Mark Hansen's house. Anne was, in some ways, as I was going through her testimony, she gave two extensive statements. She's really she's really the conscience of the book in many ways. She's the one that kept saying, "Look, Elizabeth didn't deserve this. Um, she wasn't responsible for her own death. She was a good girl. She didn't, she wasn't prowling around. She wasn't drinking. And was always defending her. And in life, she was always there to give her food and money and, a warm coat because Elizabeth didn't have one and she was always cold. So Ann Toth, she's giving this interview now, which is 2 years after the murder. She's giving this interview. And remembers Elizabeth showing up at the house. She wasn't living there at that point. So she's almost certainly living at the Guardian Inn, at the Guardian Arms with Margolis and Robinson. And tells the story of being struck and pushed out of a car. Now, Anne was always mixing up Margolis and Robinson. She'd say, well, the one with the big broad smile, or the tall one, or the chubby one. Um, she says, I think it was Bill Robinson. But it could very well have been Marvin Margolis too. And in fact,
Mhm.
might be more likely because Margolis was her boyfriend. Robinson was dating Marjorie Graham. So unless Robinson was putting a move on Elizabeth, um, it seems more likely that it was Margolis. And Elizabeth was not someone to go all the way. She was someone who she wasn't interested in sex for the most part. And there's reasons for that. But so I think it's a very good likelihood that Margolis struck Elizabeth at that point, that he's the one who assaulted her. And to follow that up, after the murder, once we know that Finus Brown has been apprised of Marvin Margolis, there are newspaper reports of him going to Boston to re-interview Marjorie Graham. And a Harvard student who was there when Elizabeth was struck. So if they're there going to interview Marjorie Graham about this period, surely they were going to ask her about Marvin Margolis because that's when Marjorie knew Elizabeth. So I
Right.
suspect that this trip to Boston by Finus Brown was a way of looking into Margolis and what was his relationship? Did he strike her? What was that? What was that like? The Harvard student apparently protected Elizabeth or stood up for her against the assault. So they wanted to look into that. And we can't know until the those files are opened and we see what Finus Brown wrote about his trip to Boston. But I suspect there's something to do with Margolis there.
So that trip to Boston, was that around the same time that the Ann Toth interview when she told of this story? Was that around, so it was a couple of years after the murder?
Yeah, it was a couple of years. It would have been after. It would have been after Ann Toth had given the interview.
Oh, okay.
It was probably towards the end of the district attorney investigation. So we're talking. 1949. I think Brown's visit to Boston was either at the end of 49 or the beginning part of 1950.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense because sometimes we think that all of the investigation all happened all at one time, but it was
Right.
over a prolonged period, right? I
Long
think
period,
people get
yeah.
that
And
wrong.
no one was even considering Marvin Margolis until Frank Jemison of the DA's office comes in and starts pulling all this information back together. And he's the one who points out, hey, what about this guy that you interviewed early on? And then the grand jury starts asking questions about this guy because they've read the reports. And that's when Finest Brown says, yeah, basically, like, I guess we dropped the ball there, and says he could be a very good suspect. That's his quote.
So the information that you got from the LAPD files from the investigation, were those the majority of those from the original investigation, and then the things that were a couple years later, those are not we're not able to get those.
Right. Basically, the only records the LAPD has released are the very, very first reports. So the report of the body being down, the identification of the body, there's all these different forms you have to fill out, dead body report, and so the first patrolman on the scene who find the body, they give a report. It's typed up, and then Harry Hansen and Finest Brown give their report of seeing the body, describe the body, the condition of all of that. But after that, so after like the first 2 days of the investigation, we don't have any of those records. Um, except for one. I mean, there is one record that was released later on during the um, ill-fated investigation of Leslie Dillon, which was a farce. But we have one file from the LAPD during that period.
So what I noticed though, a lot of the theories, if you read all the different books and things that have come out over the about this case over the years, is they talk about like who might have done it, but they never really go into, and this is what I was really interested in your book, is maybe coming up with a scenario of how the crime happened.
Yeah.
And I know there's been speculation like where and that kind of thing, but there's been, a million different scenarios and there hasn't been anything concrete that people have found, of course, after the fact that you can't go backwards in time and put that together, but there
Right.
has been some speculation. But you do kind of go into a theory in your book, and without, giving all the specifics of that, why did you think it was important to lay out this possible concrete scenario instead of just leaving that vague like most people have?
Yeah, I think as you say, I was always frustrated reading other accounts because we never find out where or how. And this was quite the undertaking to murder someone, drain their blood, cut them in half, mutilate their body in various ways, and then pack it up and deliver it to a vacant lot. That's a lot of effort. And the whole theories of it being done in a motel somewhere just don't hold up because even if it's done in a bathtub, there's going to be some residue of what occurred there. And Ray Pinker, who was the LAPD police scientist, was a brilliant guy. He was called in so many times to find blood. And if he ever found blood, it was sometimes just a little speck, and then they would find out it was something else. But he could do that. And the claim that it was done in motel, whether it's the Astor Motel or the Zodiac Motel, makes it flies against the theory, I mean, not the theory, flies against the fact that the LAPD, in conjunction with the sheriff's office, in conjunction with the Long Beach and San Diego police departments, so all of these huge numbers of law enforcement agencies are blanketing the entirety of Southern California and checking out every motel, every hotel, every apartment building, every trailer park to test for signs of blood, talking to people. Was there ever any kind of unusual activity here on those nights? And they found nothing, nothing. Harry Hansen didn't believe that it was done in a motel because it would have drawn attention. How do you get the body out afterwards? So Um, he said it must be done in a shack in the woods somewhere because that's the only place you could have that kind of privacy. So I have come up with a theory. It's just a theory, and I want to make that clear that I'm not. First of all, I'm not claiming that I've solved the case because until we have all those records, nobody can do that. And I'm also not claiming that I have found the place where the crime was committed because we don't have any evidence of that either. But it is the only theory so far that I've read that explains where it could have been done without all of the contradictions that would be if we considered it being done at a motel or at in somebody's home. It had to be a place where there was considerable privacy and an ability to get rid of all of the evidence, so all of the blood. And if there was some blood left over, it would not be noticeable. It would be just part of the situation.
Right, right. That was so interesting, and I can't wait people to read that. This is the new book. I highly recommend it. You talk about Red Manley and how he was the suspect and what that went through, and we talked a little bit about that on our episode. But there's so much more, you guys. Could not have covered it, and I could not do 400 pages in a podcast. So there's a lot more to get to there, a lot more detail. But Bill, thank you so much again for taking the time for this follow-up conversation. I really wanted to address that, the new theory that people, are talking about and bringing clarity to not only the Black Dahlia case, but also to who Elizabeth Short was. And that was really,
Right,
really important to me and my listeners that people
right,
get to know who she was, and that possibly could help us to understand in some respects what happened, and maybe how it happened, and come up with our own ideas of, the truth of what the
right.
reality was. For listeners who do want to go deeper into the story, I strongly recommend that you do. His new book, Black Dahlia Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Mid-Century Hollywood, is available now, I imagine, wherever books are sold. Also, you can find more about Bill and keep up with his work and his other books, williamjmann.com. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. And thank you for having me because I think you understand that everyone's always focused on finding the killer. I wanted to find Elizabeth Short, and
Exactly.
her death is horrible, but her life is more important. And so that's
Right.
that's what I really want to focus on here.
Yeah. And luckily, we didn't have to deal with too much speculation about her life. You were able to actually talk to people who knew her and read things that people who had said that knew her. And also, I really appreciated tracing her movements,
Mm,
through the book, because I think that tells you a lot about her and her character and who she was. Just the experiences that she had in her life really kind of gave a more clear picture of who she was. So I really
yes.
appreciated that. Thank
Thank
you
you.
again so much. It's been a pleasure, and I just really enjoyed the book. We're actually going to be doing something to give away a copy of your book to our listeners. So some lucky
Awesome.
listeners are going to get a copy. And
Great.
thanks once again, and congratulations, and best of luck with the book. And we'll have to have you back when you get to your next book.
Great. I would love that. Thank you.
Before you go, if this conversation resonated with you, I really encourage you to watch the full series, Broken, the Black Dahlia Murder. This bonus episode is just one piece of the story I provided in that series. I debunk the myths, detail the evidence, and follow the investigation that followed the Black Dahlia murder. You'll hear the real story and learn the truth about Elizabeth Short, the young woman who was the victim in this case. If you haven't already, you can find the entire series right here on the channel. And for more compelling true crime stories with new videos released each week, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching.